welcome to week 7. This week for our online portion, we are going to be covering chapter 17 and 18, which includes chronic disease, healthy eating, and trauma. This week's online objectives include understanding the CHW's perspective on healthy eating and activity, explaining the importance of using a weight-inclusive approach, defining trauma, and identify how it can impact people, discussing the ways to work with a client who has experienced trauma, and identify the warning signs for suicide. The items due this week, one is talking about weight and health assignments. The second is to continue practicing the motivational interviewing with Gabe Turner and talking to a patient about health risks. Next week is when you should reach the 80% score on that. You have your discussion board this week, and finally your reflection journal. So talking to a client about weight and health assignment, for this assignment you will be asked to watch 2 videos. One shows a CHW using the traditional approach to talk to a client about weight and health, and the second one uses a weight-inclusive approach in talking with a client about weight and health. After viewing both of those videos, you will answer the questions that are shown here under the what. So this leads us to chapter 17, which is promoting healthy eating and active living. It's important that we talk to our clients about access to food. And there are 2 terms that are often used. They are food security and food insecurity. Food security is having access to food, but more importantly, having access to healthy food, so fresh fruits and vegetables, proteins, etc., that are affordable. Food insecurity, on the other hand, is not having access to food or not having access to healthy food, which is, again, fresh food. It is estimated that almost 20% of Americans experience some type of food insecurity. And if and when you are working with low-income clients, it's important that you ask them about food availability. And if you feel they are experiencing food insecurities, have a list that you can share with them or a handout that identifies local food pantries or places where they can go for healthy food. When we think about our diets, and by diets I mean our food intake, there are many barriers on why we don't eat better. It could be family and culture. If I am living at home and I am depending on my parents to cook my meals, and let's say they're not cooking healthy meals, that would certainly be a barrier. Pleasure, time and money, and lack of confidence. Do I know how to prepare foods? Do I know what to do with fresh fruits and vegetables? And so one of your jobs as a community health worker is you will be talking to clients about weight and health. And there are some principles I want you to consider. Research has now conclusively shown that when you work with a client and focus on dieting, it actually results in poor health outcomes. So if you solely focus on losing weight and doing a diet, the results are very poor. However, when we look at it through a weight-inclusive approach, the outcomes for our clients are much better. So what is a weight-inclusive approach? First, it takes the focus away from body weight and dieting. It doesn't look at how much you weigh and the idea that you need to diet. What it does is it looks at helping patients develop their own culturally plans to enhance health and wellness. The main focus with weight-inclusive approach is to enhance health and wellness. One example, there's a program called Health at Every Size that has really good rates of success amongst their clients. And what it does is it focuses on size acceptance, so learning to love the size of your body right now. It focuses on health goals in terms of healthy eating, not on how many pounds are coming off. And it focuses on increasing physical activity. What research has found is that when people eat healthy and increase their physical activity levels, their health outcomes are very good. So it's important that we focus on those two things when speaking to clients and not about a number on a scale. The number on a scale just measures force against gravity. It does not provide a clear picture of what's going on. So some of the principles of a weight-inclusive approach. One is that we appreciate all bodies, that they naturally come in a variety of sizes. It's to look beyond weight. Weight is just a number. It's to encourage a process focus. And so oftentimes a client will come to you and say, oh, I want to lose 20 pounds in 2 months. Okay, that's great. I mean, that is a smart goal, but you sometimes can engage in all the right behaviors and not lose the pounds. Instead of focusing on weight loss, focus on behaviors that could encourage weight loss. So for example, maybe I want to increase fruits and vegetables in my diet. So my goal would be I'm going to eat at least 2 servings of fruit every day for the next 2 months or something like that. Or I am going to exercise for at least 30 minutes 3 times a week, right? These are processes or behaviors that can result in weight loss, but it's the process that you're focusing on. And then you're also working on healthful individual practices that are sustainable and activities that are pleasurable, right? It's unrealistic if you ask someone to go work out at a gym and lift 100 pounds if that's not something they're interested in. Instead, work with your clients to find activities that will bring them pleasure or that are enjoyable. So here's just another example. So a client comes to you and says her doctor wants her to lose weight. What you need to do is not focus on the weight loss, but what you should say is let's focus on behaviors and not weight loss. And then here's an example of how that could go. You could ask your client, what did you eat and drink yesterday? Let's jot it down, write the items, and then ask, well, how typical was the food you ate yesterday in terms of your usual diet? If it's usual, then continue, or if it's not usual, then perhaps ask them what a usual day would look like in terms of their food intake. And then here we have our scaling. How healthy on a scale of 1 to 10 would you rate what you ate yesterday? And then you can move on and say, why did you rate it a 7 rather than a 6? Why did you rate it a 7 rather than an 8? And then you can talk about what they're doing well. So what did you eat yesterday that promotes your health? So here we're helping them build confidence and to see that their diet's not horrible, that there are some things that they are doing right. And then you can talk about, well, what did you eat and drink yesterday that may increase your chance of chronic disease? This is starting to get them to think about behavior change and what areas in life they want to focus on. When we talk about physical activity and activity, it's important not to use the term exercise, as often people have a negative feeling, or when you hear the word exercise, it sounds boring, it sounds strenuous. So instead, we tend to use the terms physical activity and activity. And really what research has shown is any increase in any amount of activity has health benefits. Could be yoga, dancing, bowling. It really doesn't matter as long as that you focus with your client on improving some type of activity in their life. It's important that you start small. Take small steps or gradual or incremental changes. Make sure it's realistic and affordable and sustainable, something they can continue to do. And again, talk to your client about the clear benefits of increasing activity, any type of activity for any amount of time. Now, of course, there are guidelines on how much activity people should engage in per week. And while that's important to talk about, I don't think you should necessarily focus on that. If you have a client who's been very sedentary and inactive, just work on making small steps to increase activity. Our next chapter talks about understanding trauma and supporting the recovery of survivors, so people who have experienced trauma in their lives. When we look at define what trauma is, it's an emotional response to a terrible event. Could be an accident, a rape, a natural disaster, anything. Immediately after the event, it's very typical for clients or people to go through shock and denial. However, long-term reactions can be quite severe. They include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms. talk about trauma experiences, they're usually categorized into one of these categories: intense fear, feeling helpless, loss of control, having bodily harm or the threat of bodily harm, the threat or fear of annihilation. So it could be death, it could be your own death, it could be that of a loved one or even a group, or the rupture or loss of meaningful social relationships. All of these would fall under trauma experiences. It's important to note that more likely than not, you will be working with clients who have experienced trauma. As you can see from the screen, 40% of women and 60% of men have experienced a traumatic event in their life. So some guidelines when working with a client who has experienced trauma is don't assume you understand their experiences. And in order to get a better understanding of what they have experienced, make sure you ask a lot of open-ended questions to help you gain insight into their experience, how they're feeling. But in that respect, or in that regard, also make sure that the client is comfortable speaking about the event. So you may even want to start off the conversation with, are you comfortable talking about this? Because it's not helpful if you're forcing them to talk about an event they're not ready to talk about. Make sure you overcome your own biases about the trauma that they experience. I think often when we're working with people with traumatic events, we kind of put ourselves in their own shoes. And if we feel that we wouldn't characterize it as traumatic, that comes off in our body language, our facial expressions. And it's not about you and how you would react. It's really about the client's experiences with the event and, as a result, how they feel about it. Another is to let the clients choose their own path to healing or even not healing. Maybe they're not ready to face this, and that's okay. It's not for you to pressure them. Remember, in all forms of CHW work, you are letting the client guide the direction of their path. And then lastly, you are not responsible for fixing your clients or healing your clients. You are just there to support them and help them mobilize internal and external resources. And there are multiple paths for resources and resources for healing. And perhaps some of these you are going to present to your client if they're ready to look into resources for healing. But you can see here there's a long list, and there's even more. I just highlighted some of the few opportunities that are available. One important thing when working with clients who experience trauma or even clients who experience depression is to screen for the risk of suicide. You are required to report any active suicidal intent on the part of the client. Many trauma survivors think about death, and that's really normal. But it's your job to distinguish, are they thinking passive thoughts about death, or are they thinking active thoughts about death? And active thoughts about death means that they are planning to kill themselves. They are looking for a means, looking for weapons or ways to commit the suicide. So that is your job to distinguish between the two. Is this a passive thought about suicide, like, oh, I dreamt about dying, or is this active where I'm actively making a plan to kill myself? And then here are just some warning signs about suicide. These are directly from your textbook. You can also do an internet search and find more. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some of the things to think about or have in the back of your mind when you're talking to someone you may be concerned about. Some guidelines when working with a client where you suspect suicidal intent. One thing is to ask them straight out, are you thinking of killing yourself? Do you have a plan to kill yourself? Are you giving away your items? It is okay to ask people what their intent is if you are worried about suicide. You're not putting the idea in the head. You're not going to do any harm by asking them about their thoughts or intent on suicide and killing themselves. Listen without judgment and show your care. If you feel that they are in danger, and this is an immediate danger or a somewhat immediate danger, make sure you stay with that person and wait for help. Remove any objects that can be used in a suicide attempt. If you feel it's not imminent, but they're moving that way, then you can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which a number is seen here. If you feel like this is a imminent event, call 911 and stay with them until 911 appears. When we look at the trauma-informed approach, these are just some guidelines, again, of working with clients who have experienced trauma. So the clients need to feel safe in their physical space. When you are working with them, make sure that you are reading their body signals and you're not getting too close in terms of distancing, that they feel safe in your presence, that you are trustworthy, you're transparent, meaning you're open about the counseling session, not the counseling session, but the CHW session, what to expect. Try to see if you can get them some peer support or if they would be interested in learning more about peer support. Make sure that this is a collaboration. So use inclusive language such as we, our goals, so they feel that they're working with you. Give them empowerment and voice and choice, right? As you saw earlier, one of the categories of trauma is not having a choice, a loss of the control. So it's important during the time that you are with your client to make sure that they do feel empowered to do something, that they do have a voice and their voice matters. And then also consider cultural or historical and gender issues when talking to a client. One of the things when working with clients who have experienced trauma is that there's a condition called secondary trauma. And CHWs are at risk of developing secondary trauma because you are listening to the experiences of your clients' traumatic events. And as a result, you may begin to develop signs and symptoms of traumatic stress reactions. On the other hand, there's also something known as secondary resistance. And again, CHWs who work closely with survivors, it provides you an opportunity to witness courage, creativity, generosity, and resilience. So one way, again, to avoid the pitfalls of experiencing secondary trauma, which can lead to burnout, is to practice those self-care techniques that we discussed last week. This concludes our PowerPoint for this week. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Thank you.